But for me, a key alternative to the fixation around action is noticing that with some basic awareness and analysis, often no action or less action is actually the most brilliant and helpful or healing or effective intervention. Our culture has become so fixated on action that we've isolated it from many other conditions that make meaningful action possible. And that distortion affects every facet of our living, leadership, and society.
You're listening to the Joyous Justice Podcast with award-winning social justice leader and coach, Kohenet April Nichole Baskin. Let's journey into the realms of love and liberation together, dissolving internal barriers and deconstructing systemic oppression from the inside out. Whether you're leading change in an organization or your own life, your next step to advancing joyous justice starts here.
Siyo friends, before we go any further, I think I'd love to do a brief language learning moment. For the past couple episodes since this soft relaunch, I've been starting each episode by saying Osiyo, which as I understand it is a more formal Cherokee greeting, the equivalent of hello or salutations, or just conveys more respect. And Siyo is the equivalent of hi. So hi, hello, good day, friends. It's so great to have you back on the podcast. We have, or if it's your first time, welcome. I'm looking to get into some juicy material today. This is something that is often not talked about as far as I can tell, yet it's something that's been on my list of desired podcast themes for at least 3 years now, maybe 4, for a while now. So those in my inner circle have likely heard me talk about this, not to the depth that I will today, but have heard me mention it a few times. So for a handful of people, this might be familiar, and for a number, it may be new, and I hope for everyone, it will be valuable. So let's dive in. What am I referencing here? Well, you already have a little bit of a sense since you've likely seen the title, whether you're listening on your favorite podcast streaming platform or YouTube. One of the things that I've been thinking about often over the past few years is the overfixation that our society has on action and the overvaluing, the obsessive focus on action. And my response to that is, which might seem blasphemous or shocking to some, is action is overrated. I think in terms of my actual relationship, my personal relationship with action, I don't think action is overrated. But in the context of capitalism, late stage, racialized capitalism, and various other dynamics, but I think especially capitalism is a main driver here. The way that our society fixates on action to the exclusion of many other things, and the ways that action is implicitly defined because of cultural and social norms, it's become obsessive. And I think that obsession is just unhelpful and is also a part of the, for lack of a better phrase, collective death march that our society is still engaging in, and that thankfully more and more of us are bowing out of and saying, yeah, no, I think I'm good. Now, again, I think hopefully, and most of y'all are with me, but in case you're still like, I cannot believe this woman said with her whole mouth that action is overrated. Before you come for me, I'm not saying, I think I've already made this clear, but I'm not saying that action doesn't matter or that we shouldn't take action. As we'll get into in this episode, that is not at all what I'm saying. What I am hoping to convey is that I think that there is an opportunity for us to, for a number of people, and for many people in our society, they may not realize that there is an opportunity to reorient and reestablish a different kind of understanding of and relationship with action. Our culture has become so fixated on action that we've isolated it from many other conditions that make meaningful action possible. And that distortion affects every facet of our living, leadership, and society. It has personal, professional, relational, political, and spiritual implications. You'll often hear me say these lists, and maybe at some point I'll come up with a more condensed way of saying it, because increasingly in my leadership, I have become interested in focusing on interventions that run across the board. I'm less interested, not that there's no value in piecemeal strategies, but in my own decolonization, or as I like to refer to it, rehumanization or re-indigenization process. I've wanted to notice the interconnection between different issues and treat knowledge and strategies as being parts of ecosystems, and identifying what are the principles that are true consistently across the whole ecosystem of our living and leadership and spiritual being. And so this invitation to begin to expand and shift your relationship with action is relevant because it cuts across a range of different issues and can help you in facilitating better conditions for success, well-being, more meaning, and more empowered experience in your day-to-day living, in addition to wise discernment, which I'm a huge fan of. Relatedly, one of the things that brings me, that I'm proud of and or that brings me great pleasure, is that the core process, the framework that I use for the SHEMA process, which is SHEMA, SHEMA, that it delights me to no end that many people would assume that the A is about action, or that the A stands for the core thing that the A in the SHEMA process stands for is action, but it's not. I'll talk about this more in the episode, but in short, it is agency. A much more interesting, meaningful concept to me is agency. And at its full length stands for, because y'all know I love alliteration, aligned and agile agency. And over the years, that distinction has remained significant to me and has only increased in its importance. So let's get into why. Modern culture and society is obsessed with action and its narrow understanding of action, and I'm much more interested in agency and capacity. So let's talk about this action fixation obsession that our culture and society has. I believe we're living inside a culture that treats action almost like a moral virtue. I wouldn't even say almost, like it does treat it like a moral virtue. The message is literally everywhere and frequently all the time. Not that it's always said, but it's said enough in various contexts that it might as well be all the time. It's certainly everywhere. We get it. We'll continue likely to receive messaging about the paramount importance of action across all 4 levels of conditioning and lived experience. It gets internalized within us from all of these other levels. And so often when we are working on something, we are constantly trying to will or force ourselves to take action. And not that I'm saying that internal motivation is not a good thing, but it is problematic when we are essentially trying to constantly start our engine when in fact there's any number of things happening, like not all the tires are on or the gas tank is empty. So let's go back here to, as I was saying, all 4 levels of conditioning and lived experience. These 4 levels are often described as the 4 I's, but I also like to describe them more broadly as 4 levels of conditioning and lived experience. At the internal level, the interpersonal, the communal and institutional levels, and ideological. We get this message from, so to go through that, from our teachers, from different people on a person-to-person level in terms of interpersonal. As I was just saying a moment ago, we've internalized it in various communal, group, and institutional contexts. We are pushing for action. And I'm not saying that all action that is encouraged or taken in these contexts is problematic, but often there can be and frequently is an overfixation on action that is narrowly defined and perceived, that is done to the exclusion of a number of other actions and steps that would better enhance our outcomes and the quality of our actions and discernment, and deepen and enrich our agency and capacities individually, communally, collectively, etc., than just the fixation on constant action, which to me is, among other things, is an extension of, or I'm missing the word that I want here, but is closely tied to capitalism's constant metronomic rhythm of work, produce, or in our late stage capitalism phase, produce. I can't say it fast enough. Act. And where's there time for thinking within that? To take breaths, to hear our intuition, to prepare, to notice more significantly and importantly, are we moving in the correct direction? Is this still in alignment with my values? More on this soon. This overfixation on action is woven throughout leadership and professional development spaces, trainings, resources, etc. It's embedded in the advice that many of us have received and continue to receive from teachers, elders, influencers, educators. It's reinforced by social media, productivity culture. There's elements of productivity that I think are quite wise. So I'm not trying to say any one of these things are all bad, or that necessarily that what I'm speaking about is spoken of all the time. I'm saying there have been over time and continues to be a disproportionate amount of messaging about the importance and relevance of action. I suspect a number of y'all know what I'm talking about here. So maybe I'm belaboring the point, but I just want to continue to build this up before we move into the next phase of this conversation. There's just countless messages about what it means to be responsible, effective, and worthy. And a lot of that is anchored in action, which is why, among many reasons, Trisha Hersey's work around the NAP ministry is valuable and important and a sacred and worthwhile intervention. And I both affirm that intervention and also want to say there's any number of other interventions that are also critical, and at Joyous Justice, I encourage us to consider. But before we get to the interventions or the alternatives, we hear the messages in a variety of ways. Take action, move faster, push harder, figure it out, make it happen. And of course, Nike's famous slogan that many of us know, just do it. Just do it. Or as it was often said, just do it. That's not how it was often said. Just do it. Also not how it was said, but you get what I mean. So another component or culprit that I think is driving this action, fixation, and obsession is toxic individualism, such as the toxic, irrational, and fundamentally false notion of, quote unquote, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which already, when we really think about it, like it's something that we've all just heard, but it truly is an absurd idea to begin with. Like it's literally, unless you are a super athlete, virtually impossible to do. And like just even in the metaphor itself, obviously that's not literally what we're doing. It's a metaphor, but it's a weird one because that's literally not how you it just doesn't make any sense, which I think is helpful and accurate because the concept of what that image represents also doesn't make any sense. We are communal beings. We are deeply interconnected and interrelated with everything around us, not just other people, but the ecosystem, the planet we live on. We are profoundly interconnected. And pull yourself up by your bootstraps just becomes even more outrageous, especially when it's directed toward people who are chronically, systemically under-resourced, underprepared, unsupported, and are attempting to achieve goals that truly were never meant to be accomplished alone and literally cannot be accomplished alone. And underneath all of this is a largely unexamined assumption that more action automatically creates more progress and more meaningful accomplishment, that more effort necessarily creates better outcomes, that pressure, more or less to a greater extent, inevitably produces better performance. And I think that assumption deserves much more scrutiny than it typically receives. It largely goes unexamined, unquestioned, uncomplicated, and it's time, I think, to question it and offer some pushback and alternatives. So moving into the next segment of this episode, one of the things I've observed in my own life and in my work is that action is frequently treated as a key variable, when from my perspective and understanding of it, looking holistically, it often isn't. In my understanding, action is often a result, not just a key variable. People frequently conclude that they have an action problem when what's actually happening is that they're missing or under-resourced in terms of variables that matter tremendously. The issue may be ethical alignment. Let's go through some other variables here that are typically a part of an equation of success or meaningful aligned progress or desired outcomes that aren't just solely about action as it's narrowly perceived and defined in our culture. So one, it may be ethical alignment that we need to consider. If we're pursuing something that isn't actually aligned with our values, often our energy, enthusiasm, and commitment and or our spiritual alignment often suffer. In other cases, what's missing is interpersonal support. Human beings are profoundly relational creatures, yet we're constantly encouraged to approach challenges as though they should be solved individually. And often I find when I'm struggling to take action, as I've been so heavily conditioned to do, there's primarily two reasons. One is because it actually is something I wasn't meant to do alone. And that literally can mean it's actually meant to be done by a group or two people, or it means it could just be as simple as it may need to involve a phone call or some additional help. But that in one way or another, it wasn't meant to be solely done by one person. It needed help and support from at least one other person or from one or more people at varying levels of engagement. The second reason I've often seen that is behind when I haven't been able to take an action that I want to take, it's either because it was never meant to be done alone, or two, there's some extent of healing or emotional tending that I needed that I hadn't been getting. This is a common phenomenon in that for many people, the challenge involves a need for healing and or tracking for emotional readiness. If a person is carrying grief, burnout, trauma, fear, just a number of big emotions, chronic overwhelm, or even just not a chronic issue or lingering issue, but doubt, concern, legitimate emotions related to either that are happening in general in their life or related to that subject, that obviously impacts their ability to act effectively. But often this message of take action is often connected to a societal avoidance and lack of awareness and a devaluing of energy and emotion and the importance and value of healing. So often that is sidestepped and ignored, or just ignored and papered over. And people are pushed to take action when they are not energetically nor emotionally ready for it. And that is part of what contributes to more intense and difficult issues like burnout, exhaustion, and chronic overwhelm, and a range of other chronic or more ingrained challenges. There's something else I'm wanting to say here about this point. Oh yeah, another facet of this aspect of emotional tending and or healing that I talk about frequently in Grounded and Growing is often, it's not uncommon at times in my experience and what I've seen from other people anecdotally, that people encounter a situation where they know the action they should take. They are actually aware of what is the better course of action and they just can't do it. They refuse to do it. And frequently it's because there's some energy or emotional or ethical reconciliation, healing, tending to that hasn't happened. And in the absence of either it actually being addressed in the dynamic or the situation at hand, or even them having a space individually and or ideally with some partners and confidants to work through and address that issue, their intuition, their being simply can't move forward on this front in the ways that they would like to. And unfortunately, what happens is because action is always pushed within our current cultural contemporary paradigm, they end up taking another action that is not in alignment with their values, with what they're hoping to achieve. And it's not because it wasn't within the realm of possibility. It was. They just needed some additional support that could be potentially, not always, but could have been as short as 20 minutes, truly, or could have just been an extra few hours or a day or two that they honestly, in different ways, are likely going to spend anyway in terms of the extra time they'll take trying to figure out another strategy that is within reach, but likely a number of those options they'll end up perseverating or spinning their wheels because they actually know what they need to do and they just needed some additional resourcing and support in order to be able to reach that would be possible if they had that additional resource and if action weren't so heavily overemphasized to the exclusion of a range of other things. What are some of those other things? Let's keep going. At times, the missing ingredient is analysis and understanding. You and others may simply not understand some facet of what is happening in this situation related to the system, the challenge at hand, or opportunity that is present well enough to actually be able to create a course of action or figure out a series of steps that could get you there. And there's a lot of reasons why this may be one of my favorite to reference here. And I'm considering doing a whole podcast episode about this. I have different resources in my programs behind my paywall about this, but I think it would be worthwhile to do a podcast episode about it because there's still not a ton of extended information out there about this. What am I talking about? I'm doing that ADHD thing where I talk about the thing without saying what it is Professor Barbara Love's Liberatory consciousness model. And I'm not going to talk about the full model, though it is brilliant and wonderful and so helpful for social change leadership and issues related to a range of adaptive challenges that are also tied to social injustice and, when addressed, help to move us toward collective liberation. But back to this piece. And in her model, there's a few different components, but one of them is awareness. What I've learned from her about this is that, and I agree with, is people often mistake their awareness for being all four of the other levels. And they think just because they know some key facts about an issue that that's sufficient, but that is not actually analysis. There is more to learn about that topic. And then there's also ways of integrating it into your broader understanding of the world, of society, and of the story of your living. And in the absence of having that more effective understanding of an issue, it often leaves people susceptible to missing key insights that if they understood that, they would be able to devise a more effective, efficient, meaningful, and impactful course of action. And that would account for not just that specific issue, but understand it in relationship to other interlocking components about related to the system or the culture or the dynamics, the broader dynamics within which they're operating, which would again help them devise a more sustainable and effective and enduring long-term solution or set of solutions to a significant challenge that they're facing. It's a little tricky to talk about this because I'm amalgamating, like I'm combining together a bunch of different scenarios that I've helped clients navigate. But I'm getting a little lost in the amalgamated form rather than sharing bits of confidential stories. But hopefully you're picking up what I'm putting down here. And if not, there's a little link in my show notes to send me a message, or you can just go to joyousjustice.com or shoot me an email, and I'm happy to, on the podcast or on social media or directly to you, further explain this or anything else. Other times it's a matter of awareness, as I was just alluding to, and it might be that there's an issue where one isn't even aware of it at all. And when we don't have some basic awareness of an issue, we may not yet be seeing the actual issue underneath the issue or understanding the dynamics at play in a situation, not even from, as I was just talking about a more advanced issue, but even in more basic ways we might be taking something at face value. Whereas if we had a little bit more awareness about that subject, we would be able to make more informed choices and figure out what is necessary in that situation. This is sort of an odd place to put it, but for me, a key alternative to the fixation around action is noticing that with some basic awareness and analysis, often no action or less action is actually the most brilliant and helpful or healing or effective intervention. The intervention may actually be to reduce or slow down different actions. And one of the key variables with that is awareness and analysis, so that rather than continually taking action for hours, days, weeks, sometimes even years, and then finding out that part or all of that was largely harmful, unhelpful, ineffective, it's worthwhile to invest in awareness and analysis in addition to accountability and then action, as Professor Barbara Liv teaches in her Liberatory consciousness model. Some of the best things we can do is not do a range of things that we've been conditioned to do in our society and culture that aren't actually helpful for us or other people, despite what we've been led to believe, actually undermine our efforts. And with greater preparation and resourcing in a range of different ways, it depends on the circumstance we're dealing with, that there may be a shift or an expansion of what the actions are, and also a cessation, a slowing down, a decreasing of a range of other actions that undermine our objectives or that undermine the pursuit and achievement of our objectives and our broader goals and desires and dreams around collective repair and collective liberation. Finally, sometimes it's accurate perception and acceptance of reality that is needed before action is taken. In various situations at times, we may be responding to what we wish were true rather than what is actually happening in that moment or in that situation. This is a whole separate subject that is one of the 6 components of the Aligned and Agile Agency A in the SHEMA process. And one of those is acceptance versus aspiration. And I'll just say briefly, it's important to have a balance between those two. And also there's a bit of a relationship where in order to have effective aspiration, we need to actually engage in a certain amount of acceptance, not approval, but acceptance of the facts. And I've seen, and you can see throughout different efforts in the world and from individually to collective to societal, that certain interventions are not effective because they're in denial about fundamental facts of the situation, and they haven't accepted those. And because they haven't accepted those, nothing or much of what they do won't be effective. To me, the metaphor that I often think of is like climbing a mountain, like scaling a steep mountain. And if you're not actually engaging with how steep it is, or you're trying to step in places where you can't, or you're just kind of hitting a wall on the mountain rather than acknowledging what's actually happening and the task that is before you, you can do any number of things. But if you're not in relationship with the actual ground or mountain or rocks with which you are navigating, you're going to slip, you're going to fall. Like if you're pretending there's a rock there because you want it to be there, but it's not there, that is a liability. It's dangerous in the context of rock climbing. And it also is a liability. I don't know if I would quite always say dangerous, but it can be in our lives and in our work when we aren't acknowledging the facts of a situation. We don't have to be limited by them. We don't need to be attached or complacent about them always being the case. But if those are in fact the facts involved, are in fact the facts in a given situation, by being in denial about them, it undermines our strategies. And this happens, unfortunately, more often than one may think. So these are just a few examples among many of other facets of situations beyond simply action that when you account for them, it leads to better results. Another one of the things that I commonly say that I didn't say at the beginning, because I often just say I just talk about this for a few moments, but I wanted to build out my thinking about it and really break it down and get into it with y'all. But when I'm talking about it briefly, like one of the things I commonly say is, it's not that action isn't important. I think it's just one of the least interesting elements of what is involved in engaging in life and making effective decisions. And also that action is often a natural outcome that just flows. It doesn't need to be forced. When you give people the resources they need to work with the energy of it to manage their mind in effective ways, to think about what's happening here and what is most effective, naturally, typically, the action flows from there because people are clear about what's happening and they feel confident and assured in the steps they are taking. And so you don't need to push it or force it because people are moving with greater intention and authentic internal alignment and are anchored in their agency, are anchored in their capacity and power to choose. They're no longer operating in a default or a kind of fatigued and tired and then pushing themselves mode, but are getting nourished and resourced in the ways that make the most sense. Not even for, and so this is part of the work in Grounded and Growing, is doing that resourcing and equipping in incredibly efficient ways so that then action just flows. And then that's not the final step, which often in our society, that's kind of how it is framed. Like obviously there are outcomes, but people often just fixate on the action. Like that's the big thing. And for me, again, that's just one of the lesser interesting parts of it, because for me, I'm interested in within the SHEMA process of aligned and agile agency is, what are we appreciating about what's happening, what's happened? How do we appreciatively think about what are the next steps we want to take? How are we anticipating in light of what we've just navigated? And because we weren't just in the midst of all of it, we were also at times on the balcony and in internal pieces of it. And as I often talk to my clients about and people with whom I'm working, in terms of the work we do in Grounded and Growing, when you're not rushing and you actually take time to tend to healing components and or emotional and energetic elements of a situation and really understanding yourself better and the situation better through that, you begin to have a deeper perspective. And because you've emptied your mental and emotional cup in the process of working through this issue, you have more capacity and space mentally, emotionally, and spiritually to have deeper and more effective perception of the other actors and people involved, and also to understand the issue. Even in situations where dynamics are quote unquote unpredictable, people are actually quite predictable. It's just that often we are too flooded to be able to use all our mental faculties to understand what's happening. That is interesting to me. That is an element of wisdom, of cultivating and fostering wisdom over time, which is an element of what I think of as agile agency. I have this dorky thing I do where I make my fingers on both hands into two V's and do agile agency, and I connect them and then flip it upside down, converts into wisdom or becomes wisdom over time through regular practice. Those are just a few of the things. Also accountability, allyship, accomplishship. There's so many other A's in addition to other actions that don't have to be A's and alliterative that are much more effective and meaningful after action assessment, evaluating what's happening here, not just constantly going for the action, but what are the preconditions to effective action? And what are the things that help us evolve our agency and our being and the actions we take in the context of our authenticity and agency? So I'm going to conclude this episode right here as conclusion of part 1 of 2 or more parts. We'll see how many we get to. And I welcome you to be in touch as always. This has been interesting and there's more I'm excited to unpack here that can hopefully help you and others dethrone action and make it more of a peer and a colleague to a range of other elements and behaviors that are effective and essential for success and intentional evolution, repair, and living and leading in more holistic, sophisticated, and purposeful ways. More soon, and I'm so excited and honored to be in ongoing dialogue with y'all. I truly wish I could know how what I'm talking about is filtering through your being and your heart. So really, if you have a moment, maybe even now, and you want to shoot me a message at info@joyousjustice.com or through the Joyous Justice website or through the little link in the show notes, if you feel so inspired, I'd really love to hear. And again, there's at least 2 or 3 more episodes or parts of this to come. And I just can't wait to share those. But in the meantime, thank you so much for tuning in. And I wish you much love and nourishment in the meantime. Until next time.
Thanks for tuning in. To learn more about Joyous Justice LLC and how you can work with April, check out the info in the show notes or visit joyousjustice.com. If you enjoyed this episode, show some love. Subscribe or leave a comment wherever you're listening. Tell your people, share what you're learning, stay humble but not too humble, and keep going because the future is ours to co-create.